Right. We have been talking about adaptation, and we have been talking about experimental studies that have been done to study adaptation. We had talked about some observational studies that have been done to study adaptation. And again, remember that in order to show that something is an adaptation, we need to be able to show not only that this trait is used for something, but that in using this trait for whatever it's used for, it improves the fitness of the organism. Yes? Yes? Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about now are some comparative methods. And by comparative methods, I mean, typically to do this, you need a phylogeny. And if you look in the textbook under the comparative methods, it talks about the phylogeny. And I mentioned that it would talk about something called phylogenetically independent contrasts, which I will not hold you responsible for. Okay? But I will give you two examples of comparative methods that show that a particular trait appears to be adaptive. Now, the first one I'm going to show you, and again, like I said, for these, you kind of need a phylogeny of the group you're looking at. So you have to have some significant knowledge of multiple species. Yes? You with me? To have a tree, a phylogeny. Okay. And the first example I'm going to talk about is one that is discussed in the textbook. The second example I'm going to talk about is one that's not discussed in the textbook and that I actually did for my dissertation all those many years ago. Okay. All right. So the first one I'm going to talk about that's discussed in the textbook is bat testis size and group size. And by group size, I mean the size of the roosting groups. Yep. You with me? Okay. So we all know that bats roost together in large groups, but some, well, okay, in groups, I should say, but some roost in small groups. So there may, for instance, be a set of 8 or 10 that roost together under a big leaf. Okay, that would be a small group. But we know on the other end of the spectrum, I don't know how many of you have ever been to someplace like Carlsbad Caverns or Bracketville in Texas, where there's these large groups of bats that roost under bridges. Okay, but there can literally be millions of bats roosting together in a single location. Okay, and what it's been suggested.
It doesn't look like they unplug anything. This
Okay.
I don't see any of the cables loose.
All right. What was it? Do you know?
It was on the wrong output. So don't know if somebody did change the input just on the remote. Either having to select HDMI 3.
HDMI 3. Okay. And did you have to push something on here?
Let me power it off just to see if it's going to stay in that.
Okay.
Because it could have been somebody.
HDMI 3. It could have been that they switched it from that. That's good to know it's HDMI 3 because I wasn't sure which HDMI it was.
They should have switched it. Or also, I'm going to restart it just to make sure that whenever it's turned,
sure,
it does go to correct.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Then whenever I plugged it back in, I plugged it into a different one than whatever it had.
Okay. Okay. Well, and like I said, that's good to know because I can do the HDMI 3 thing. So anyway, thanks for coming up so fast, by the way. All right. So the idea here is this, that every time you see large groups of bats, as opposed to small groups of bats, thank you very much. Okay. What you see is that the males tend to have larger.
So they won't be tempted if they see it.
Oh, yeah. If they have larger group size, that the males tend to, yes, Hala. Say it louder. Okay, we are on page 382. So if you're reading in the textbook, this example is on page 382. Okay, all right. And what they see is that in larger group size, the males tend to have larger testis size. Now, can anybody think of a reason why in a larger group, why males might be selected to have larger testes? Go, Catherine. And why might they like the ones that are bigger? Okay. The idea here is that you assume that there's probably some sexual selection going on because that has to do with reproduction. Okay. But perhaps more than even the females choosing the males, which is a possibility, is that males are simply in competition with more males. And if you want to father more offspring, how do you do that? Provide more semen when you mate. Because understand that if you're in a large group, there are lots of males and there are lots of females. And if you want to have an advantage, having larger testes might be a useful thing. Now, as I said, you find that larger bat roosting size, almost invariably larger testis size. Now, the reason, however, why you need the phylogeny is because you need to be able to map the traits onto the tree. Because if I told you that here was the tree, but on this branch were all of the larger larger roosting bats. And so, in other words, large roosts and large testis size. Would this be good support for, if that was the only place on the tree where those two traits occurred and all the descendants had them, would this be really good support for the idea that ecologically speaking, large roost size always comes with large testis size? Would this be good support for that? The answer would be no. Why not? Because both happened one time. One time. Okay, sample size of one, not very big. Okay. But suppose what you found instead was this, that if you look at the phylogeny of bats, and large group size and large testis size were there, and large group size and large testis size were there, large group size and large testis size, large group size and large testis size, large group size and large testis size. Would that be good support for the idea that every time large roosts evolved, that larger testis size evolved as well? That would be great evidence for the suggestion that evolving larger testis anytime there's a larger group size is somehow adaptive, because it happens every time. And what do you suppose our phylogeny looks like for bats? Does it look more like this or like the first example I gave you with just the one example at the bottom? You think it looks more like this? It looks more like this, okay? You've evolved larger roost size many times in different branches of the bat phylogeny, and every single time you see larger testis size, okay? And so understand that if that's what's happening, that would suggest that large testis size is truly adaptive to being in large roosts. Yes? You with me, everybody? Make sense? Okay. And this would not be a hard thing to evolve every time, because there's going to be variability in testis size. And if every time the roost gets larger, there's this selection for larger testis, of course, those are going to succeed, pass on their genes, and the males are going to ultimately evolve larger testis. It's not going to be a difficult thing to have happen. Yes? Yes? And you understand what we're talking about from a comparative method. We're comparing across the phylogeny different branches, and we see the same thing over and over and over again. Yes? Yes? Okay. Now, the other example I wanted to give you was this one. This is not in your textbook. Like I said, this is from my dissertation. Since you're wondering what a tiger moth is, I'm going to show you what a tiger moth is as soon as the computer comes up. Tiger moths are called tiger moths because a number of them have, well, stripy patterns, like a tiger. Okay, stripy patterns like a tiger. Now, what's funny is if you type in just tiger moths, you're going to get pictures of airplanes because apparently there's a set of airplanes that's called tiger moths. Okay. Mhm. I'm getting that. Here, I'm going to go to Bing. Why is it doing? Oh, shut up.
These things are awful. You always miss one tiny part of the square somehow. And it counts the whole background. And it makes you do 5 more.
I don't even know why I was doing it. Because it shouldn't just for search. These are tiger moths. And as you can see, they're kind of nice and showy. Okay. Most of these are of just a couple species, but there's a huge variety of them. And you'll notice that they are brightly colored. Okay. You will also notice that some of them are doing displays. Like, you know how you get them to do this display with the hind wings being shown? You simply touch them. Brightly colored hind wings are shown because they move the forewings forward. That's one display they'll do. Some you tap them and they'll do a display like that as well, where they kind of put the wings up and show off the brightly colored body. Okay. So they have this behavioral displays where they're showing off the brightly colored parts. Why? Because they taste bad. That's it. They taste bad. Okay. And I know from personal experience they taste bad. Okay. Yep. I'm a scientist. Gotta have firsthand knowledge. Gotta chew on the occasional tiger moth to make sure they really taste bad. Now, understand I'm not one of the normal predators, so it wouldn't necessarily matter if it tasted bad to me. What it matters is that it tastes bad to the things that actually eat them. Okay. But tests that have been done with bats, they don't like it. Okay. Now, very good. You will notice that this tiger moth has a blob. Here, I'll make it even bigger. I have been blocked. I apparently won't make it bigger. Okay, well then I won't make it bigger, but hopefully everybody can see that yellow blob right there. You see that yellow blob? Okay, this is what's called reflexive bleeding. You have moths with these glands on the back of their thorax that if you touch them, they ooze this fluid. Okay, so they have behavioral displays. They have reflexive bleeding. And one other thing I will tell you about, it'd be kind of fun if I showed you videos, but I'm not going to take that much time to do so. I'm just going to tell you about it. This is a group of moths that makes noise. Bright color works great if you are trying to show off bad taste to a daytime predator. But most of these moths fly at night, okay? And bright color doesn't do you squat at night. So a number of these moths make sound. I know you think moths that make sound. Yeah, these moths make sound. Bat echolocation calls go out. They respond in turn with a organ they have on the side of their thorax that literally kind of goes, okay? And for some of them, you can actually hear it. Now, of course, a lot of the sound, though, is ultrasonic because what they're trying to do is talk to the bats. And the basic idea is the bat hears that sound, grabs the moth, takes a taste, goes, bleh, spits it out. And so the sound at night works like the color does during the day. It's a warning that I taste bad that works at night. So I'm gonna do that. Sound warning at night using timbal organ on voice. Okay, now what's interesting in this case is that it's pretty obvious that the ancestor of the tiger moths did all of this. Everybody hear what I just said? So in other words, this all evolved down here. Those are tiger moths. What you see here is loss of one or the other of these defenses. Do you understand what I just said? Now, what you tend to see, and hopefully this makes sense, little ones, the little species, tend not to reflexively bleed. Does that make sense? Would anybody like to explain why that would actually make sense? That bleeding that they do is fluid from their body. Yes? Does it cost them anything? Yes. Okay. If you are smaller, you have less fluid. You can't afford necessarily to secrete this fluid if you're tiny. Yes? It's also true that the bigger species tend to display more. So you see both of these in bigger species. Not that you can't see them in smaller species, but a lot of smaller species don't reflexively bleed, and a lot of smaller species, instead of displaying, will either fly off immediately or they'll simply drop to the ground and disappear into the undergrowth. You with me, everybody? Whereas the smaller species, and again, there's a lot of overlap. There's plenty of big species that do it too, but there are several bigger species that seem to have lost the ability to make the sound. So you tend to see these emphasized in the littler species. I'll say smaller. Littler is a weird word. Smaller species, okay? Again, I'm not saying it's across the board, okay? But what that means is that you have lost certain abilities on different branches. Now, again, if all the little ones were on one branch and all the big ones were on another branch, this wouldn't be much evidence for the fact that different ones really do work better for one or the other, because it would have been a one-time deal. But what you find is across the board again, little species there, little species there, little species there, tends to have lost the ability to reflexively bleed, lost the ability or doesn't behaviorally display. Whereas if you got a really big species here and a really big species there and a really big species there, they tend not to make as much sound. Okay? You with me? Now, it's not necessarily intuitive why the bigger species would not make sound as much, although the bigger species, it takes longer for them to warm up, which probably explains why if you touch them, they display, because it's easy to display, a lot harder to fly off immediately, okay? And so maybe they're just not spending as much time in the air. They don't need it as much. So it's not super easy to understand why. But again, it's another comparative case where in different species at different points in the phylogeny, you see that one or the other of these defensive mechanisms has been lost. Okay? Questions? Comments? Does this make sense? Everybody? Okay. Yes. Savannah. What? Where are what? These tiger moths? All over the place. We have a whole bunch of tiger moths here. If it's too late in the year probably for me to find them, but it'd be fun if I could bring one in and actually have it make sound for you, because some of them make, like I said, sound that's loud enough for you to hear. Now you kind of have to do this and kind of squeeze them a little bit, okay? Because they'll make sound in the hands of any predator. That doesn't have to be a bat. The idea being that if you're a lizard or something and you have grabbed it and it starts making this noise and it tastes bad, it still works the same. It's like the lizard will go, oh, made that sound, tasted really bad. If I hear that sound again, I won't eat it. So anyway, so kind of fun. Here's another example. And again, in this case, it's sequential loss over and over and over again in the tree. You got me? So not quite the same, but it still suggests that certain ecological pressures are going to lead to emphasize certain defensive mechanisms over others. Okay? All right. Now, I have another example of something to discuss with you, but I'd like to kind of go out of order just a little bit, because the next thing I'd like to talk about is trade-offs and constraints. Now, what the heck do I mean when I say trade-offs and constraints? Well, as you will find out, I can mean this at different levels, especially the word constraint, because I will talk about the concept of an evolutionary constraint. I will talk about the concept of a physiological constraint, okay? And the concept of trade-offs is more a physiological phenomenon. And I will point out that we've already talked about an example where I can talk about a trade-off, although I haven't given you the trade-off yet. Understand that in nature, that every organism has a certain amount of resources that they need and a certain amount of resources that they can get. In order for them to survive, they obviously have to get at least enough resources that they meet all of their requirements. Now, it should also be obvious, however, if they allocate more resources to one thing in their body, then they will have less resources to allocate to something else. Does that not make sense, everybody? Because we're going to ultimately end up talking about this idea a lot. So let's go back to the bat example I was just talking about a moment ago. If they allocate more resources to their testis size, do you suppose that they therefore have to allocate less resources to something else? Okay. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be true, because understand it could be that those with bigger testis size simply need more resources and have to get more resources, yes? But it turns out that if you compare the size of all the other organs in the body of those with larger testis size, there is an organ that is a little bit smaller than it is in those without large testes. Anybody happen to know what organ that is? Did you read the book? Anybody? What was that? It is the brain. As weird as that may sound, and now I know you're all going, so they make themselves dumber by producing more sperm. That is not the case. I said a little smaller. We're not talking like they lose half their brain because their testes are bigger, okay? They still have plenty of brain for what they do. It's just that their brains do tend to be a little bit smaller. It's a trade off. Okay. And I will point out that with the tiger moth example, that's basically what we were talking about there as well, that there is a trade-off. There is, yeah. Larger body size allows you to reflexively bleed because you obviously had to get more resources in the first place to be larger. Yes? Being smaller, there's a trade-off. You can't reflexively bleed. You cannot afford to lose that fluid. And something else I didn't tell you is a lot of tiger moths don't feed as adults. Now, some do, several do, okay, but some don't. And so if you don't feed as an adult, you really can't afford to reflexively bleed, okay? And in all fairness, you might suspect that those that reflexively bleed copiously, and there are some that do, clearly must also feed as adults. Yep. Because that's the only way you can afford to produce copious amounts of bad tasting fluid. Okay. And by the way, why would you want to reflexively bleed? Just to make the point, I realize I was assuming this was obvious, but let me make sure everybody is clear on this. Why would you reflexively bleed? The idea is you give a taste of yourself to the predator without the predator chewing on you. Because understand, if you're bad tasting, and we talked about this with some butterflies before too, bad tasting butterflies, okay? If you're bad tasting, that's great for the species, but you still have to train the predators, and it may not protect the individual, because the individual may get chewed up, and well, that's great for everybody else. Ain't so great for that guy that got chewed up to train the predator. Well, by reflexively bleeding, predator gets you in their mouth, they get this mouthful of ooze, and they taste you without chewing on you, spit you out, and you get to fly and reproduce another day. Yes? Hopefully that makes sense. How? I'm not saying that every species that's bad tasting, even if they don't reflexively bleed, couldn't survive the predatory encounter, because some insects that taste bad on the surface, okay? Or you might chew on them just a little bit and get a bad taste and spit them out, and they might survive, but there's no guarantees on that. This is like you're trying to guarantee the fact that you would survive the predatory encounter, okay? Anyway, so trade-offs. Hopefully the idea is clear. We're going to talk very much about another very common trade-off, which I kind of hinted at with both of these examples, that size matters, because size of testis matters, size of the moth matters, okay? Yes? And we've already talked a little bit about offspring, okay? Because we mentioned stabilizing selection for many species of birds and mammals in terms of their offspring, right? Yes? But are there some birds that produce really big eggs? Are there some birds that produce really small eggs? Are there some mammals that produce really big offspring? Are there some mammals that produce really small offspring? All you got to do is think marsupials, right? Okay. Yep. What are the trade-offs? If you make big offspring, you can make only a few. If you make smaller offspring, you can make more. Yes? And we're going to talk about that a lot. Now, we're going to talk about that, however, when we get to the life history traits. I'll give you just a couple of examples right now, however. Okay? All right. Now, when we talk about constraints, okay, obviously organisms can only do so much because their physiology only allows them to do so much. They are physiologically constrained. They cannot do more than they can do. Yes? I mean, that sounds like an obvious statement, but you understand the idea of constraint. Like, I can go out and I can run from here to Sequoia down the stairs, but if you ask me to run a marathon, I can't. Why? Because I'm physiologically constrained. Okay, I haven't trained. I'm kind of old. Okay, I'm physiologically constrained. I can't do it. Okay, you with me, everybody? So you understand the idea of physiological constraints. And of course, that ties in with the resources we were talking about as well. If you only have so many access to so many resources, you can't do certain things because you don't have enough resources to do that thing, whatever that thing may be. Now, that's physiological constraints. Are there also evolutionary constraints? And what might I mean by an evolutionary constraint? Anyone? Go, Catherine. What? Yeah, that'd be a perfectly great example. Okay. I've used the idea of we're not going to see pigs fly several times. And every time I say, why are we not going to see pigs fly? Because they don't have the genes. They don't have the right set of genes. I mean, a pig is a big, massive mammal that's never going to get off the ground. Okay. Doesn't have appropriate genes. It's constrained. As we've said multiple times already, every gene comes from pre-existing genes. Okay. Mutations do allow you to develop new traits. Mutations allow you to develop new traits. Okay. But it's still from the code that's in that gene. Okay. You can't just make some extraordinarily new trait out of nowhere. You are constrained by the genes you have. Okay. And hopefully that makes sense as well. Which, of course, is why not every adaptation, and for that matter, no adaptation, is a perfect adaptation. Okay? Adaptations are as good as they can be based on the genes that you have. Yes? Yes? Okay. So maybe it would be nice for me to give you an example that I could point to, okay, of trade-offs and constraints. And I'm going to give you two pictures of two flowers. Will it let me view this image, or am I blocked from seeing this one too? Let me see this. One where I was blocked from the previous one. Okay. Textbook talks about both of these examples. So, and if you're wondering about what page, because I know Hala is, okay, I'll get there. The begonia example is on page 390 and 391, and the next one I'm going to talk about is on page 391 over on the page 392. Okay. All right. So on the left here, we have a male begonia flower, and on the right, we have a female begonia flower. Okay. Now, you may wonder, why am I showing you? And we all understand that different flowers have different ways of reproducing. Yes. Some flowers have both male and female parts in them. Some plants have separate male and female flowers. Okay. That's where the terms monoecious and dioecious come in, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for those terms because they're always confusing. Always confusing. Okay. So I'm not going to hold you responsible for monoecious and dioecious. If you want to know what those words mean, take the plant courses. Okay. But here we have separate sexes in separate flowers. There's a male flower and a female flower. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, it matters because the female flowers offer no nectar. Well, isn't that interesting? Okay. Do the male and female flowers look pretty much like one another, though? Oh, yeah. You suppose that's by accident? No. Why would it make sense that the male and female flowers would look a lot alike? So the pollinators will still go to the female flowers. Now, having said that, I will point out that experiments have been done that show if you artificially enlarge the female flowers, they get more visits. Everybody hear what I just said? So looking like the male is important. Now, we're not changing the color. When I say artificially enlarge, I mean we make the petals bigger. We add white material to the petals, okay? So they still look sort of like the males, they're just bigger, okay? Now you might ask, therefore, then why aren't the female flowers bigger? The answer is because there's a trade-off going on. If your female flowers were bigger, how many female flowers would you be able to produce? Not as many as if they are smaller, okay? And so, by being the same size roughly as the male, you are still making sure you get pollinated. And in all fairness, the more flowers you have, the more seed you make. So just because an individual flower gets more visits if it's bigger, doesn't mean it's good for the entire plant. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So this species has opted to make more smaller flowers, which truly does lead to more seed set. Is that your fitness? Your seeds are your fitness. They're your offspring. Okay. So looking like the male helps improve your chances of getting pollinated. Okay. Because the males do offer nectar. Okay. And producing more small flowers is actually beneficial because that leads to more seed set. Yep. Yes? Makes sense? So the trade-off here makes complete sense. More smaller flowers improves your fitness as opposed to fewer bigger flowers. Yep. Makes complete sense. Okay. The next one I'm going to show you, another flower example. It's a trade-off here too, but it's a very, very different kind of trade. Now, of course, all these images, what one do I want to choose? They're all lovely. I'll choose that one. This is a flower. Oh, I'll write that on the board. Examples. Begonia, male and female flowers. And the next example I'm talking about is something called fuchsia flowers. Now, why are they called fuchsia flowers? Because they're fuchsia. Now, not everybody knows the color fuchsia. Anybody want to tell me what fuchsia is? What? Well, it's sort of a reddish purple, a warm purple color. Okay, fuchsia. Okay, and in this case, we've got both red and purple parts in these fuchsia flowers. Turns out there's lots of different breeds of fuchsia flowers, and for obvious reasons, people grow them as ornamentals. Okay, and there's some fuchsia flowers that are fuchsia throughout their entire blooming season. They're just fuchsia. They produce these lovely fuchsia color flowers. However, there is a wild species, and they show this picture of this wild species here, okay, on the bottom of page 391. And in this picture, although it's dark, and surely they could have gotten a better picture, but obviously they didn't care. It is dark, but you can still see that on this particular fuchsia plant, there are fuchsia colored flowers, but there are also green colored flowers. Now, what's going on with the green colored versus fuchsia flowers? Well, it's a good question. And this is another one where remember how we started this chapter with an example where we were talking about giraffes' necks are long so they can feed. And it's a nice story, but we found out that that's not likely the case. Okay. Well, here, the flowers start out green. And then once pollinated, they turn color to fuchsia. Everybody hear what I just said? So the same flower changes color after it's pollinated. Okay? All right. Now, why, after they're pollinated, does the plant retain these already pollinated, and why do they pollinated flowers, and why do they change color? Well, of course, the thinking was that green flowers would be less obvious. They blend in with the vegetation. So clearly the fuchsia flowers help attract pollinators, so they find the green flowers. Sounds like a nice hypothesis. Turns out it's completely incorrect. Okay. You go along to a fuchsia plant that has these flowers that change color, you whack off all of the fuchsia colored flowers, the green ones still get pollinated exactly the same. So retaining the fuchsia colored flowers for a while after they've been pollinated has nothing to do with continuing to attract more pollinators. You with me? Even though it sounded like a good story. So the question is, why the heck are they retaining these flowers? Because they retain them for many days, and they do change color, which understand has to be a cost to the plant. Yep. So why the heck would they do that? Part of the answer lies in this picture. Because here, oh yeah, I'm still pointing. Here is the end of the female part right here. That's the end of the, do you remember what you call the female part of a flower? Bang, bang. Pistil. Okay. Not spelled the same, P-I-S-T-I-L. Okay. And this is the stigma and the style, and the ovaries at the base of the style. Okay. Don't care if you know that terminology. But the idea is, here's where the pollen is dropped off. Now, what's pollen? We've had this discussion. Packets of sperm. Okay. And you deposit them here, but where do the sperm have to go? To the ovary, way down at the base of the flower. Okay. And how do they do that? Anybody know anything about flowers and know how that happens? What? Well, they grow what's called a pollen tube. As soon as the pollen is deposited on the stigma, that's right here, there's a tube that starts growing through the style down to the ovary, because even though it's a plant, sperm still have to swim. And they swim down the pollen tube to the ovary where the sperm will fertilize the eggs, which become seeds. Okay? You with me, everybody? So I'm hinting at part of the story here. How long does it take to grow that pollen tube? That would be some time. Why? Because the dang pistil is freaking long. So it takes a while to grow that pollen tube and for the sperm to get to the egg cells. This is why they retain those flowers. You understand what I'm saying? This is why they retain the flowers, because if you go along, as soon as they turn color, if you whack them off, no seeds. You with me? No seeds. You have to let the pollen tube grow. The sperm have to get to the eggs to fertilize them to produce seeds. So they are constrained by the amount of time it takes for the pollen tube to grow. Now, would anybody therefore like to tell me why the flowers change color? Well, what's a flower for? Attracting, say it, pollinators. Would changing color have anything to do with the pollinators? Well, we already said it doesn't help attract more to the green flowers. What does it do? It tells the pollinators, I'm already pollinated. Don't waste time coming here. And makes your pollinators more efficient. They change color after they're fertilized, and therefore the pollinators don't waste time going to those flowers. Okay? And all you got to do is watch the pollinators and you can see that that's true. Okay? Yes? And so here is an adaptation that through observation and careful study, you can see what's going on. Okay. The change in color is to prevent pollinators from going to those flowers and have them only go to the ones that need to be pollinated. But they have to retain the flower so that they can actually be totally fertilized, because it takes a long time for the pollen tube to grow. Okay. So they have to continue to put resources into these flowers that are already pollinated until the eggs are fertilized by the sperm. Okay. Yes? Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. All right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do this as well, kind of get to the end of this chapter, and then I'm going to go back and hit 2 other examples, if you don't mind. Okay. As I just said, all traits were originally some other trait. Okay. All traits were originally some other trait. We've already talked about the fact that gene duplication may be really, 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 really important, because this gives you raw genetic material that can mutate in all sorts of ways. Okay. Yes. All right. For instance, I'll just give you some examples of things that were something very different in the past, and we can trace their evolutionary history. What's this? Not a trick question. What's this? My ear. Thank you. That's what I was asking. Okay. Everybody knows I use my ears too. Here. Okay. And are there some bones in there? Yeah, there's some really tiny bones in my middle ear. Okay. They're called the hammer, anvil, and stapes, or stirrup. Sorry. I was using 2 English names and a Latin name. You should not mix your English and Latin names. Okay. Hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Okay. Now, those tiny bones, were they always in the ear? Nope. Anybody know where they were? In our long, distant, somewhat reptilian ancestors? They were actually in part of the jaw. Now, you're going, how do you know? Because there are fossils of intermediates where these bones are literally changing shape and moving toward the ear. You can see. Remember how I talked earlier in the semester that people always complain there's so many missing links, this can't be a real thing. Well, that's bullcrap. There are lots of links in the fossils that can show you the progression from one state to another. Okay. And these jaw bones, these extra little bones that were in the jaw, have migrated to the inner ear and now allow us to hear. Okay. Because our lower jaw now, really damn simple. It's a single bone. Okay. Used to be more complex, partly because the jaws were longer and had more teeth and that kind of thing. Our jaw, one bone. Okay. It's actually 2 that's fused in the middle, but still 1 bone on either side. Okay. Yes. All right. You want another one? Well, feathers. Okay. Feathers started off as little pointy things with a little frill. Pointy things with a little frill on the edge. Okay. All right. Used for, likely, we've had this discussion multiple times now, used likely for warmth. Okay. Yes. Used likely for warmth. Okay. Is that the only thing they're used for now? No. Of course, they modified through time. Yep. Modified through time. And allowed at least one group of organisms to learn how to fly. Okay. Learn how to fly. To fly. Okay. All right. Metamorphosis hormones. Now, what do I mean by metamorphosis hormones? Would someone like to tell me a group of vertebrates that goes through an interesting set of metamorphoses? Starts out life looking like one thing, ends up life as looking like something completely different. Group of vertebrates. Don't overthink this. Okay. Frogs, amphibians. Why? Because they start life looking like fish, start life looking like fish, but then of course they metamorphosize into, well, a much more typical tetrapod, a four-legged creature that can live on land. Not all of them do, but they do. Okay, yes, they go through a metamorphosis. Okay, well, do you go through a metamorphosis? Certainly not the same sort of thing. You are never a fish. Okay, although you have a tail. Okay, and you don't start off with limbs, but you grow limbs very quickly. Okay, you don't have to have metamorphosis hormones to go through what you go through in your development. Neither do reptiles, neither do birds. Okay, so metamorphosis hormones gone in reptiles, birds, and mammals. Interestingly enough, in reptiles, there doesn't appear to be anything that is reminiscent of metamorphosis hormones. Can you find a pseudo gene for metamorphosis hormones in reptiles? What's interesting is you can. Okay. There still seems to be that genetic material there. It just doesn't do anything. Okay. Same true in birds. Okay. But in mammals, remember how earlier I said it's often very difficult to find a pseudo gene that has been modified and then turned back on? Okay. Well, here's a case that's probably a good case. Because mammals do something, of course, that other vertebrates don't do. Okay. And what do mammals do? I know we do many things, but what's one really obvious thing that mammals do? Indeed, it's why we are called mammals. What's one obvious thing that mammals do that the other vertebrates don't? They produce milk. Okay. There's a hormone that's responsible for that production. It's called prolactin. Oh, imagine that. Prolactin for milk. Okay. Yes. Guess what? It's modified metamorphosis hormone. Okay. So here we have a gene that was used for one thing in the past and clearly has been modified to be used for something completely different now in a different group of organisms. So this is just extending the idea of every trait you have was at once some other trait. Okay. Yep. You with me? Pretty cool. All right. All right. So having said that, let me make sure you understand what is required here. Okay. To understand that development of a new trait, we need to be able to establish the ancestral connection. We need to be able to either physically see the evidence or chemically see the evidence, like with the prolactin and metamorphosis hormones being similar. Okay. And you have to be able to at least have some idea of the transformational sequence, how we got from here to there. Well, with the jawbones moving to the inner ear, I mentioned there were several fossils that give you a nice picture of the transformational sequence. Okay. Understand that if you know the transitional sequence, or even if you don't know the entire transitional sequence, that there's something else that must be true. That every intermediate stage must at the very least be at least neutral, but much more likely needs to be selectively advantageous. Because understand, if it's not selectively if every intermediate stage is not selectively advantageous, you're not getting to the next stage. You follow what I just said there, everybody? Every intermediate stage likely to be selectively advantageous, basically has to be at some point. Okay. And let me go back to the feather example, because here's a case where it's pretty easy to understand how every intermediate stage would be advantageous. You're a relatively small reptile with feathers. You have a mutation that makes them a little bit more aerodynamic. You can't fly, but what you can do is jump from this tree, glide downward to the next tree. Is this an advantage? If some predator is chasing you up this tree, being able to do that would be selectively advantageous. You get another mutation, makes you a somewhat better glider, still can't fly, still selectively advantageous, still selectively advantageous. Okay? Yes, until you do get to the mutation that allow you to flap your wings. And again, it wouldn't be like the first organism that ever flapped flew a long distance. That wouldn't be the case either. But flapping would get you a little farther. Would that be advantageous? Sure. Yes? So you follow what I'm saying? That for one trait to evolve into something else, all the stages in between would have to be in some way advantageous. Okay. Now, we can't point to exactly why the moving of the jawbones from one position to another would have necessarily been selectively advantageous. Clearly, they weren't selectively disadvantageous, but again, to get them to progress, they'd have to be advantageous. Okay. Yes. So in some cases, it may be difficult to explain, but other cases like feathers, clear cut. Yes. Yes. Okay. And understand, we used this word before. I mentioned, for instance, that giraffes evolving long neck for combat was a pre-adaptation for feeding on acacia leaves high up in the trees. Every intermediate stage is therefore pre-adaptive for the next stage. Pre-adaptive for the next stage. Yep. You with me, everybody? We good? Okay. So I kind of jumped ahead there, left out two examples. I fixed the link for the example I wanted to show you last time because it's really cool and I want to show it to you. So I fixed that link and I'm going to show it to you today. Give it a little bit of time to come up. Hopefully you remember the example where I was talking about the picture wing flies and how they mimic the jumping spiders. And that for the picture wing flies, the test that was done involved 5 different groups, and it showed that both the pattern on the wings and the wing waving were necessary. Both of those things. Yes? Okay. Well, I'm going to show you a group of moths, and this group of moths is another group of insects that mimics jumping spiders. And you will see, again, how this is an adaptive advantage for the moths. So let me go scroll down. Like I said, I think I fixed the link. Hopefully it will come up. I did. Go. All right. So what we're going to see here, and I'm going to turn out at least part of the lights here because these are a little dim. What we're going to see here are 4 quick videos. 4 quick videos. I'm going to show you the interaction between 2 jumping spiders, and you'll get to see the males doing their leg waving I was talking about. Okay. So here's an interaction between 2 male jumping spiders, and they're just going to wave at each other. It's not going to take them very long to do this. Look at me. Little waving, and the other guy's waving too. Okay. Wavy, wavy, wavy. Okay, that's enough. All right. Number 2. This is the moth. Now, before I show you this moth, what this moth is doing is sitting on top of a leaf. And it's weird because the moth is sitting here and the front wings are like put up like this and the hind wings are sticking out like this on the sides. Okay. Weird posture. But if you kind of look at the wings, you can imagine maybe a jumping spider in the pattern on the wings. Okay. And the fact that it's darting around on the top of the leaf, okay, suggests that it's pretty confident. Like, I'm not gonna get eaten by predator because predators look at me and go, that ain't no moth, that's a jumping spider. And it's very jerky. When jumping spiders move around, a lot of times they'll run fast and stop, run fast and stop, and run fast and stop. So when you watch this video, you see both of those things going on. You get that kind of looks like a jumping spider when you look at it from that angle. And you'll notice he's kind of jerky in his movements. Okay, very much like a jumping spider. And again, we don't need to see the whole video. Okay, but that's just a little bit of the activity of the moth. Okay, so that's the moth by itself. This third video shows a very unhappy demise of a typical moth. Jumping spider sees this moth ends up being food. Okay, so this is the normal response of a jumping spider when it's presented with very reasonable prey. And you will notice just how fast they are. He's like, ooh, yeah, I see that. And bing, you barely even see it when they jump and grab the moth. Anyway, so, and you can see why they're called jumping spiders. Climb, again, that's the normal response to normal prey, okay? So we go to video number 4. Here is the response of the jumping spider when presented with the moth that we were just showing you walking around, okay? Here's the moth, there's the jumping spider, and see what the jumping spider is doing? You'll notice the moth doesn't have to wave its wings in this case either. Okay, remember the picture wing flies did have to wave their wings? They just look enough like them. Because you'll notice the male, again, waves his legs. So what does the jumping spider think he's looking at? Another jumping spider. Okay, that moth is clearly not prey. So pretty cool. Okay, so I thought that example was kind of fun because you get to see it actually in action. And with the videos I showed you, it's very clearly a very different response to this moth than it is to your typical prey moth. Okay. All right. Okay. And then the last example I want to tell you about deals with a phenomenon we talked about once before that can also be adaptive. We're going to talk about this particular adaptation in a population of what are called water fluids, phenotypic plasticity. Does anybody happen to remember what phenotypic plasticity was? Because we talked about it once before. Phenotypic plasticity? All right, I'll help you out. See that color of my skin there? See that color of my skin there? Is it the same? No. Why not? Phenotypic plasticity. I have expressed more what? Why is this skin darker than this? More melanin production here than I have here. Yes? Okay. Different genes? Different genes here and here? No different genes. It's all me. Okay. I don't have different genes in different places. I have the same genes. So how can I express them differently? Phenotypic plasticity. Same genes, different phenotypes. Okay. Now, here we're just increasing the production of melanin. We're just expressing certain genes a little more. But when I presented this to you before, I mentioned, and when I mentioned before was that genotype by environment interaction. That's how I presented it before the first time, where the environment, this is not just the environment influencing traits. What it is the environment turning on or turning off genes. You understand what I'm saying? So two different individuals can have the same genes, but have different phenotypes because in this individual, a certain set of genes is turned on that are not turned on in this individual. Phenotypic plasticity. Okay. All right. Okay. Now, I promise you this is a chapter on adaptation. I will connect this to that. Okay. Because still genes, which means they're still selectable. Yes. Okay. All right. And what we're looking at is a group of what are called water fleas. That's a water flea. Okay. They're that big. Okay. Really tiny. Okay. Prey. Yeah. Predators too. Turns out that they're also predators on anything that's smaller, but they are prey to small. They live in water. Small fish. Okay. This experiment, although the experiment was not done until the very end of many, many decades, okay? But this was done with water fleas that lived in a artificial man-made pond called, I'm not sure I care whether you know this name, but I kind of like the name just because it's a weird one. It's Oud Heverlee. It's a man-made pond in the Netherlands. Got to be Dutch. Okay. Oud Heverlee. All right. And what they did was in this pond, and this is also in your textbook, by the way. So let me tell you where this one is in the textbook. It's on page 387 over on the page 389. Okay. All right. So initially, when this pond was constructed in 1970, there were no fish. They didn't put fish in the pond. Okay. Water fleas swimming around. Okay. Fish were introduced in 1976 in large numbers. Okay. Daphnia swimming around, obviously prey for fish. Okay. Then later on, around 1988, fish were largely removed. They didn't get every single one, but there were very few fish left in the pond after 1988. So over the course of a couple of decades, we started off with no fish, then we had lots of fish, and then we finished with not very many fish. Okay. All right. You with me, everybody? Okay. The Daphnia behavior in the pond, obviously, with no fish, they swim around. They're a predator. They ate what they ate. They didn't get eaten. No big deal. Now, there is one more part of the story that we need to make sure you understand. What's one more part of the story you need to understand? Did humans stock the pond with Daphnia? No. We didn't care if there were water fleas. How'd the water fleas get here? Because this actually is an important part of the story. How'd the water fleas get here? Did they hop across the land from another pond? No. How'd they get here? Did somebody start to say something? Probably underappreciated for small things getting from pond to pond is this phenomenon. It's water birds stepping around in the shallows, picking up mud on their feet, in which there are, okay, not adult water fleas, but eggs. Eggs. They ride to the next pond, dragging this crap on their feet with them. They step in the next pond, the eggs come off. Voila. Water fleas have moved from here to there, thanks to the birds. Okay. Now, why is that an integral part of the story? It's because the eggs can last for a very long time. They can go dormant. And so what happened, what the scientists did was they took some of the sediment from the bottom of the pond. And there was sediment in the bottom of the pond that went all the way back to the beginning of the pond. And there were eggs all the way back down in that sediment. So the eggs could literally last a couple decades alive. Okay. And so what they did was they took eggs from different layers. They took eggs from the bottom layer when there was no fish. They took eggs from the middle layer when there were a lot of fish. And they took eggs from the top layer when, again, there were hardly any fish. And what they did was they tossed these Daphnia in to these different containers, and they introduced fish chemicals and watched what the Daphnia did after the eggs hatched, of course. Yes? So they hatch the eggs from early on, they hatch the eggs in the middle period, they hatch the eggs in the late period, and then they dump fish chemicals into these different bins. Now, this is the same population of water fleas over decades. So they're all descended from one another. They have the same genes, okay? The Daphnia in the original one, you put fish chemicals in there with them, they don't do anything, okay? Now, I shouldn't say they didn't do anything. A few of them dropped lower down in the water. Now, why would dropping lower down in the water make sense if there were fish? Harder to see, because fish are visual predators, okay? It's called negative phototaxis. That should sound familiar to you. Negative, okay, away from, phototaxis, movement away from light. Okay. And so a few showed a little bit of movement downward, but hardly any. You dump fish chemicals in with the adult Daphnia that came from the eggs from the middle period, and they all swam down. Why? Because they were in a fish-rich environment. Fish chemicals meant predators. And any of them, understand that during that time period, any of them that didn't drop down got eaten, okay? And then with the last group, you throw the fish chemicals in and, again, a lot less response. Not no response, but a lot less response, okay? So here we have a set of genes that can be turned on or off based on presence or absence of the fish, and their phenotypic plasticity persists through time. Okay, based on their environment. Okay, and so even genes that allow phenotypic plasticity can be adaptive, and that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Perfect timing, because now we're ready to go back to chapter 8 and the adaptive significance of sex. So